Great. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Again, welcome everybody. My name is David Martinez III. I am a director at Vitalyst Health Foundation and a proud Flinn-Brown Fellow from the inaugural class, the guinea pigs, if you will. This is actually my first time hosting a CivEx. I am so excited to be able to do so. A huge fan and super user of the network. I hope you all are doing well and had a fantastic holiday, and that your 2025 is starting robustly. I also hope everybody is doing well. I caught a bug that was making its way around town last year, but I might have a little bit of remaining stuffiness, but hopefully I'm coming through loud and clear, because we do indeed have a fascinating and impactful conversation to have regarding a collaboration that I've been working on with Don at the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership, our friends at the Center for the Future of Arizona, our some national and community partners as well. But for those of you who don't know me, again, my name is David Martinez. In my role at Vitalyst Health Foundation, I have the great opportunity to not only direct our grants program, but our portfolio area that we call Civic Health, which is the first lesson of the day. What the heck does civic health mean, and why would a health foundation like Vitalyst be engaged in this work? Civic health, as we define it, is how communities come together every day to tackle their toughest challenges. And since we're a health foundation, how those communities are coming together to improve the health of their neighbors, their communities, our state, and ultimately our country and our democracy. It seems like a really lofty goal, but especially as fellows know, we come together every day. Our neighbors or residents come together every day to tackle their toughest challenges, no matter of party, no matter of backgrounds, because we know that we have certainly more in common than what divides us. And that's really a lot of the themes that we're carrying into this new year in otherwise what seems like a tumultuous time. But we know that especially the language that we use in this space, in this democracy space, in the civic engagement, civic participation, civil dialogue space is so, so important. And now we have data to show just how important it is, especially when we're thinking through how other populations, other demographics, other communities perceive certain words that are often used in this space. So we, over the past several years, have been partnering with a national organization called Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, or PACE, which is a collaborative of funders who have invested in this larger democracy space. We are proud to welcome Siri Erickson from PACE, who has been a project lead on what is called the Civic Language Perceptions Project, or CLPP, that Vitalyst has been able to partner on in collaboration with, again, the Flinn Foundation and our strong partners in the civic health space, the Center for the Future of Arizona. Throughout this time frame we have together this afternoon, we'll be hearing more from Siri and the great team at PACE to provide some national context to the research and data that they spearheaded nationally, in which we had an oversample here in Arizona around civic language and perceptions regarding certain words that we use in this space. Of course, we'll drop that data down here in Arizona and reflect on what we saw in the oversample that we supported here in Arizona with our great partners at the Center for the Future of Arizona, with Kristi Tate, the Director of Civic Health portfolio on that front. And then one thing I really loved about the work that we did here in Arizona to really embed the data and see how it was being framed and used and solidified is we connected with the Civic Life Partnership that is facilitated by Kristi, NCFA, and Don at the Flinn Foundation, and connected with Scott Koenig with the Arizona Rural Leadership, as well as our fellow Flinn-Brown Fellow Teniqua Broughton with the state of Black Arizona, to host a series of community conversations to vet the data, reinforce it, poke holes in it, and then figure out how we can just use it to the best of our abilities as we continue the great work here in Arizona to improve and strengthen civic health here in Arizona. So, so let's get started because we have a really robust agenda. I first am going to toss it over to my colleague Siri Erickson, who is a program support lead, again, with Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, Vitalyst, and I know Flynn is a really proud member of this national network of funders in this space. She is going to join us and provide an introduction to PACE and some background on the Civic Language Perceptions Project, the national data, and then we'll take a deeper dive here about the data in Arizona. Siri, welcome to Arizona virtually, if you will. We are so glad to be able to partner really strongly with PACE in this effort, and I'll toss it over to you.
Thank you so much, David. It's so great to be here with you all, especially since I've been walking alongside the team in Arizona for a few years. It's just been amazing to see what you have done on the ground with this data. So I'm here to provide a little bit of national context before we turn it back to a deeper look at the Arizona data. A little bit about how we got started in this research at PACE. So about 5 years ago, some of our members started noticing that there was a big disconnect between the civic terms that they were using and the terms that seemed to be resonating or not with their grantees and their communities and the general public. And so we thought, okay, let's get some research to our members so that they can tackle this problem. And we couldn't really find any. So that led us to embark on creating the research with other partners, including some of our members. So in 2019, we did a first smaller study, and then we did our first big, robust study of civic terms in 2021 in partnership with some of our oversample groups like Arizona. So we had 5,000 registered voters across the country from all different backgrounds, all different geographies, ages, etc., political identities, race, all kinds of different demographics. And we really felt like we got a nice representative sample on the national level. And so just a few top line findings that I want to underscore with you today before you look at the Arizona specific data. First of all, we looked at 21 terms. And of all of those 21 terms, we could mostly say that Americans are actually pretty positive in their perceptions on those terms. And we don't want that headline to get lost because it can be so easy to kind of go word by word and have worries and fears about how those words aren't working the same way anymore, and maybe we shouldn't use those words anymore. So we want to not lose the main finding from our study, which is that Americans overall are positive on most of the 21 civic terms that we tested. Now, of course, there's a lot of variety by demographic. And so you're going to see a little bit more of that in the Arizona data, and there's a lot of richness there to pull out as well. But we only had a few words that weren't at least scoring at a 50 or more percent of the public being positive on those terms. And we didn't have any words that were over 25% in terms of the number of people who said they actually had a negative perception on those terms. So where some terms were much more positive than others, but in general, where positivity was lower, it was actually unfamiliarity or neutrality that was higher, not so much on the negativity side. So we think that's an important finding to underscore and to not lose sight of as we look at some of the deeper findings and the nuance in the data. The second thing that I think will be of interest to this group is that in 2021, we tested a cluster of terms that use that civic word. So we had civic health, we had civic infrastructure, we had civic engagement, and then we had civil society. And when we started unpacking the data, we noticed that those 4 terms were behaving in a similar way. And so we started to call them our civic cluster of terms. And what we noticed in the civic cluster is that in general, the positivity, so positive perceptions were fairly low relative to other terms. However, Most of what was high on those terms was unfamiliarity and neutrality. We also asked people, who do you associate terms with? And we found with the civic cluster, people didn't have very strong associations of any particular group with those terms. So we think that finding is important for people who work in civic spaces and in the civic field to understand that those terms don't strongly resonate with the public. That, again, doesn't mean we shouldn't use those terms. I think we are going to keep using those terms, but it does mean that we need to be aware of helping people fill those terms with definitions, with meaning, with experiences, and with positive, hopefully, associations. So there's an opportunity in those terms to actually help people have a stronger connection. And that's why we don't want to just stop using them. We want to actually help educate people so that they understand what those terms mean. We also did test in a later round the term community as a stand-in for civic. And that, as I think many of you intuitively might guess, had a much stronger positivity across the American public. So it can be helpful to use that term community alongside the civic cluster of terms. I would caution us, though, they're not exactly synonyms, right? Civic and community. I think sometimes community has more of a close in, like my community feel, whereas in a sense, civic is not filled with people we pick or choose. It's more like the public that we are a part of. So they're not synonyms, but they can be used together to enhance each other. And then finally, a third finding would be that we want to make sure that everybody hears the message coming out of our research that there are no bad words to say. So we don't want our research to be used to say, well, we should stop saying that, but we should always say this, right? And so what we want to say is know your audience, know what terms resonate more strongly with them or not, and then think pretty clearly and intentionally about what you're trying to do with your messaging. Are you trying to connect with people? Are you trying to motivate them to some kind of action? Are you trying to send a particular signal with your terms? Like, we're going to use some terms that maybe score, higher on the positivity scale because we know that they're going to appeal more broadly across different identity groups. And maybe we'll use other terms in other kinds of settings and spaces where we know that they're a better fit for the audience that we're trying to reach, that type of education we're trying to do, or the action that we're trying to motivate people towards. So those are some top line findings. If we just look at the Arizona data quick compared to the national, we saw some similarities and of course some differences, but I want to point out the similarities here today. So if we're just thinking about the top 10 most positive terms of our 21, number 1 was unity and number 2 was liberty. And that was true both in the national data and in the Arizona sample. And then if we're looking at the top 10 most negative rated terms by the American public, number 1 was the term privilege. And number 2 was the term social justice. And that was true in the national sample as well as in the Arizona sample. So in between that, there's a lot of interesting variation and difference between the national study and the Arizona oversample. But at those kind of high levels, there's also a lot of congruence. And so that is what I want to share with you today. And now I'm going to turn it back to David so that you can all get into your Arizona data more deeply.
Great. Thank you so much, Suri, for providing that context to the Civic Language Perceptions Project, some of the high-level national data that we're seeing. We'll take a deeper dive into the Arizona data in just a moment, but just to kind of highlight some of the concepts of the Civic Language Perceptions Project, 21 terms. We'll showcase through the slides that Kristi will present a little bit what those 21 terms are, especially as we begin to look again at the data. I'm really fascinated about the civic cluster because when I first saw the data and saw that the phrase civic health had a stronger negative perception, I was devastated because that's a portfolio that I oversee. And I know my colleague Kristi, she's a director of Civic Health at the Center for the Future of Arizona. So I'm like, Kristi, what is going on? Why don't people embrace this concept of civic health? But our friends at PACE reminded us that just because there might be kind of a negative perception, it might be more so that people just don't know what it is. So we have this really great opportunity to better define what it is, and that's certainly what we've been trying to do. I love this concept that there are no bad words. I feel like I have used a couple of bad words while screaming at the television over the past couple of weeks, but I get your sentiment, Siri. There are no bad words in this project. Even this concept of privilege and social justice that didn't fare so well perception-wise, as opposed to like unity and liberty. This doesn't mean that you just kind of control F to find those words that we're using in documents and in our language when we're working in this space. Again, it really is about knowing your audience and knowing the intent of the messaging that you're trying to convey. So you got this kind of national perspective. Now, of course, let's bring it to the great state 48. So proud to be able to continue to partner with my friend Kristi Tate, the director of Civic Health at the Center for the Future of Arizona. Kristi, take it away. Oh, before I start, of course, Donna is going to slap my hand because I forgot to provide housekeeping notes. This meeting is being recorded and we will be posting it on the Flinn website and the amazing Flinn communication channels, including YouTube. We'll follow up with an email probably on Thursday with the recording and survey. And then certainly folks have already begun to use the question and answer or Q&A box. Please do use that function throughout this CivEx, and then we'll have a live Q&A with Siri, with Kristi, and our great panelists at the end of the session. Kristi, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, David. Yes, really excited to be a part of the conversation and to delve into the titles of the work that we do today. So excited to hear from Siri. Also, it's been a really great partnership with PACE, and then many of those organizations that are on the call. So many of the participants I know today have been a part of this journey with us. So we're excited to share more. I'm going to start with a little bit of grounding in who we are at CFA and the Arizona Civic Life Partnership in terms of what brought us into this research and into the conversation. And then I will provide a snapshot of an overview of what we learned from the Arizona sample. I'll start by saying, if you're not familiar with our organization, the Center for the Future of Arizona is a nonprofit organization, and we're really driven by this mission of building a stronger, brighter future for our state. And all of that is really in service of this shared vision of success called the Arizona We Want, which has been informed by close listening and decades of survey research and extensive community engagement with Arizonans to really understand our shared aspirations and hopes for the future and our shared public values. And core to that, since we began this journey and understanding what Arizonans want, has been this pillar of civic health, of hearing from Arizonans that we really have a hunger for civic engagement that solves problems and a democracy that's working for all of us. So as David shared at the beginning, this idea of civic health really being the process of how we come together to define and address public problems and build that roadmap for the future is a vision that we share at CFA and that our partners do at the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership at the Flinn Foundation. So we've been really proud to work together on the Arizona Civic Life Partnership, which we launched in 2021. We came together with this vision of how could we really bring partners together to use data that can drive action, generate greater dialogue and understanding of civic health. So through conversations exactly like today, and its importance really for being able to realize any of the shared public values of the Arizona we want. And then also to have a hub where we could work more in concert and collaboration with each other as organizations who care deeply about these issues to really make a greater impact together towards shared goals. So that was the inspiration for the partnership. And part of the history here is that we started by bringing together close organizations in a steering committee to help advise and shape the work. And we wanted to jump in with, what do we know about civic engagement and civic life in Arizona? Where are we headed? Where is action needed? And what we heard from our partners was that we actually needed to step back first and say, are we even kind of speaking the same language? Do we have a shared understanding? And that converged with this opportunity with PACE as they were asking themselves those same questions as Siri shared to get involved with the National Research Project on Civic Language. And with the support of David and Vitalyst Health Foundation, we were able to do this oversample in Arizona to really dig in and understand what's happening here in Arizona in our communities with how we relate to these terms in civic and democracy work, and how might we use that to better inform our understanding of each other and the work that's needed. So I'm going to share just a snapshot of some of the findings. I will say, if you're interested, hopefully if you're tuned in watching as we go, please pull up the report, the infographic as well. I think we'll put that in the chat if we haven't already, so you can start to delve in and kind of browse the data yourself. What we'll share today really just scratches the surface of this information, so we hope that that report is a much broader resource for you. But I'll start by saying, kind of echoing what Siri had shared, that for Arizona, so much of the terms really tracked, I think, with what the research team was hearing nationally. But what was interesting that was shared with us was that Arizonans react more strongly to terms. So these positive terms like unity, liberty, patriotism, citizen, they showed up as high positives in the national population, but for Arizona, it was stronger reactions. So one good example of that is patriotism. What you can see here on the slide, and if you're just listening, I'll share out some of the data points as well. Patriotism had a 54% positive response nationally from respondents, but here in Arizona, it was 67.5% positive. So a much kind of stronger reaction there. What we also saw was with negative perceptions, there were higher reactions, stronger reactions in Arizona. So the terms that showed up as the most negative were similar: privilege, social justice, activism, racial equity. You can see in both, but there were terms that were reacted to more strongly. So even looking at privilege as the top negative nationally, 36.8%. Here in Arizona, that was 47%, almost half of those folks responding negatively. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind as we talk about and kind of digest this data is that respondents could answer they either felt positively about these terms, they felt negatively, they didn't know, so they could say, I don't know that term, I don't have a definition or a sense of that, or neutral. So to this point earlier that we'll delve in a little bit more with around the civic cluster or civic health, those terms may have had high neutrals, so it may not be that they were high negatives necessarily, if not positive. They may have been that folks didn't know or they didn't really have a strong opinion. So keeping that in mind as we view this. Just to go into a couple of the comparisons, and again, the report itself goes a little bit more deeply into these groups and into the analysis. I think that one of the key takeaways, as Siri shared nationally and then here in Arizona, is that the diverse communities of our state really reflect diverse uses of language and responses to these terms. So when we look at comparisons by different subgroups, you can really start to see those differences emerge. I know this chart is a little busy, so I'm going to orient you to a couple of the key findings. This is looking at a breakdown of older Arizonans. I will say that's 35 and older. Younger is 18 to 34. David and I did not define the brackets of older and younger, so no questions, please. That came from the research team. But the older responses are reflected in purple. And what you can see is that there were higher responses and positives for older Arizonans on terms like liberty, patriotism, citizen. So those areas where there are diamonds on the chart help direct your attention to where the biggest differences were in those groups. So a term like patriotism had 76% of older Arizonans responding positively, compared with just 41% of younger Arizonans. When we look at where are some of those kind of reversals, a good example is racial equity. So 65% of younger Arizonans were responding positively to that term, 44% of older Arizonans responding positively to that term. So you start to see that there are some pretty meaningful differences. What we also looked for was where is their alignment? So when you see those bubbles start to sort of overlap on the chart, terms like justice, belonging, common good, common ground, those were terms where older and younger Arizonans had similar perspectives and that were generally more positive. So if we look at a comparison by education, this provides a breakdown of those with a college degree and those without a college degree. And you can see that there's some pretty big divergence on a few terms. The first at the top that was the highest positive for college graduates is democracy. So 75% of those with a college degree responding positively, and just 55% of those without a college degree. Interestingly here, this is where the civic cluster that Siri mentioned really shows up. If you scan towards the bottom of this chart, they're not very high positives overall, but there are stronger positives among college graduates to civic infrastructure, civic health, civil society. But those were terms that were pretty low positives for those without a college degree. Looking again, where is there alignment or similarity? Liberty, citizen, diversity in this case, we're above sort of the median positivity, and we're also very closely aligned. And then the last one that I'll go through today is looking at a comparison of whether folks identified as living in an urban community or a rural community. And what we heard from the research team was that for Arizona in particular, this was one of the biggest determinants of having a higher differential in responses to terms. The other largest driver was political views and affiliation. So if you were an urban or rural resident, or if you had different political views, that connected more to having differences in how you receive the terms. So here you can see there are more positive terms among rural residents reflected in orange. So justice, citizen, as great examples, civility, those are very high positives among rural Arizonans, and then lower among urban. The reverse of that, scanning down the chart, terms like diversity, activism, more positively received by urban residents over rural residents. So a term like diversity had 75% positives from urban, 54% from rural. Activism, an even bigger spread there, 51% of urban residents responded positively, just 13% of rural residents responded positively. And then looking for that alignment, just to call out a couple, democracy and common ground here were both higher positives and pretty aligned between residents. So again, just a snapshot, but trying to orient folks to what does this data tell us? What kind of information is here? How might it be a resource? We hope this helps kind of provide some food for thought for the conversation today. And where I'll land is to say what was really important to us was to bring this to our partners and say, can we start to make sense of this together first? We held community conversations with many of the partners on the call today. We'll get to hear from Teniqua and Scott, who are really amazing partners in hosting those sessions with us, to really start the process of, what does this mean? Does this actually resonate or track with our own experience? What are some of the gaps? What are the implications for this research? Just to share out a couple of takeaways for us, and then I'm excited to hear from Teniqua and Scott what their lessons were from the process. We know this data is limited. It's survey data. There are limitations to the sample, the methodology, but it really did, for us, help affirm the importance of language. And through the community conversations, the participants were really echoing, understanding this provides a little bit more insight into understanding one another and how we might be able to use this to actually build bridges and strengthen a sense of community, while also understanding where are the ways that we're maybe shutting down unintentionally, excluding, kind of deepening divisions, potentially inadvertently through language. So I think what we learned from those community conversations and echoed through the participants' responses was that there's something here that maybe we can use to better understand each other and to inform the work that we're all doing to really strengthen civic health. So excited to hear from Teniqua and Scott, kind of their takeaways, and go from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristi, for that dive into the Arizona specific data. Being a native son and proud Arizonan, it doesn't surprise me that we had a more strong reaction to the words than at the national level. We definitely react more strongly in a lot of different ways, but really fascinating kind of differentiations between age, as you highlighted, education, college educated, non-college educated. And then, of course, something we talk about a lot, the urban and rural divide, right? How we use that language, the perceptions of that language here in Phoenix, even in Tucson, a lot different than what is used, say, in Lake Havasu City or in our tribal and rural communities. And then a note too, we recognize that as often with data, there are some limitations. So we'll take we'll kind of unravel that a little bit more in the panel. So thank you so much, Kristi, for the partnership, for highlighting those great insights around the Arizona data. Carol, I see your question in the Q&A boost. How will these findings be shared with candidates, campaign to update the literature and websites and social media message to resonate with their audiences? I know from a Vitalyst perspective, we've not done too much active outreach to candidates or elected officials for this information specifically, but it's out there. Please visit the website that we posted at flinn.org and share with the networks that you have, the candidates and elected officials that you're working on to be able to infuse into their own messaging and learn from the data. Professor Shugarinsky, great to see you, my friend. Did you do interviews or focus groups to understand the reasons for some of the responses? For instance, why civic engagement is a relatively negative term. That might be a really great segue into the panel that we're leading, because as part of the Arizona data, Kristi and Don, as part of the Civic Life Partnership, did host a series of community conversations, including with the two groups that we're welcoming now as part of our panelists. Again, we welcome Scott Koenig with the Center for Arizona Rural Leadership and fellow Flinn-Brown Fellow Teniqua Broughton with the State of Black Arizona. Welcome to the panel. Before I toss it over them to introduce themselves and their organizations, Kristi, did you want to address Professor Shugarinsky's statement about the interviews or focus groups?
That's a great question. I think our approach for the Arizona research was what we'll dive into, holding the community conversations first to sort of understand how we all responded and made sense of this data. But I will say one of the frequent themes of those conversations was that exact desire for more information. Folks really wanted to understand what was going through people's minds as they answered this. Why would they respond that way? Could we do follow-up? Could we dig a little bit more deeply? We actually used the exercise of going through kind of a polling experience in our community conversations ourselves to respond to some of the terms first. And I think that put us all in the mindset of filtering through the different things that go in your mind as you're responding. And I'm sure we'll get into that in this discussion. So that was our approach. And then maybe Siri will be able to respond later as well. I know Pace did a lot of follow-up work in terms of potential focus groups with other community partners, which would be great to hear about as well.
Great, thank you so much, Kristi. And we'll certainly bring back Siri at the end for more Q&A if she has additional things to reflect on. Thank you so much, Professor. Yes, so now we welcome again Scott and Teniqua. Teniqua, please introduce yourselves for those folks that may not have had the pleasure or the privilege of meeting you.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you again, Kristi and David, for the opportunity to really talk about our civic perspectives, community conversation. So those of you who may not know me, I serve as the CEO for the State of Black Arizona, which is a data repository around issues and concerns as it relates to African Americans across the state. We really are here to uplift the voices through recognizing that there are inequities in several of our areas of education, economics, civic health, infrastructure, and then healthcare. And so our goal really is to make sure that we're making decisions with the data and the lived experience to make sure that better outcomes really support our Arizona.
Good to see you, Teniqua, and thank you, David, Kristi, everyone, for having the Arizona Center for Rural Leadership, which I have the pleasure of running with a team. And I am so honored to lead that group. We have a public-private partnership with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. So we utilize their network of offices in every county. And every year we recruit 16 people from across the state to go through a comprehensive, emerging, engaging lifetime learning curriculum that takes them to 7 different Arizona counties. Then we visit Mexico and Washington, D.C. So over 700 people have graduated from our program to go out into their communities and make a difference in a way that's meaningful for them and needed by their communities. So you'll find people from the grassroots all the way up to who have run for federal office to local office, creating new nonprofits, all of that. I think the thing that's in common about all of our graduates is that they really want to give back and that they are invested in Arizona. And so this opportunity to participate in this, it really helps build bridges, as people have already been saying, and help bridge that rural and urban divide that sometimes can exist.
Thank you so much, Scott. Yeah, you started to kind of elaborate a little bit about kind of what might have inspired you to really engage in the Civic Language Perceptions Project. But can you kind of take a deeper dive into why you kind of took the mantle and said, I'm willing to host this community conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. It all fits into our strategic roadmap. We took feedback from our alumni and what did they want and how did they want to remain engaged. And our chair of our alumni committee lives in the town of Cottonwood and is involved in a variety of organizations there, and including the town. And so she helped us host this community conversation in Cottonwood. And it really brought together the group of people who all kind of know each other. That's the beauty of small communities. Whether they had anything to do with our organization or where they were a Flinn-Brown scholar or the Center for the Future of Arizona, they came together and they kind of knew each other. And I think what's most interesting is, I know we'll get into more of this, but they had that curiosity. And so they were like, I don't know what civic health means, but I might want to learn more. So that's when we have a curious bug, we follow it.
And Teniqua, I know that you are just instinctively curious, but in addition to that, what really inspired you, especially as you all, with your organization, the State of Black Arizona, holding that equity lens, really inspire you to be part of the Civic Language Perceptions Project as well?
Well, being a Flint-Brown alumni, class of 2013, I made a commitment to just make sure that there were more individuals that looked like me who were participating in the academy. So for me, this has just been a part of the work I've been doing every year to make sure that people understand what the fellows program is. I think my interest in being able to engage us in a community conversation is, you said it earlier, around data and really understanding data. And because the state of Black Arizona is always trying to make sure that my community is a part of the aggregate to even disaggregate it, I wanted to make sure we had a voice. So our community conversation really focused around the individuals who graduated from our African American Leadership Institute. So several of them came for an afternoon over lunch to really look at the data that was provided in front of them. And I think the curiosity around it, as we'll get into sort of what are those themes, is to really look at, synthesizing what we saw in front of us with some of the challenges that are met, whether it be limited data, small sample size, margin of error, some of those challenges. And so those are some of the themes that I'll share as we talk about it a little bit more. But our leaders who were in our African American Leadership Institute were our focus group. And so these individuals came from many different classes and who are in many different sectors.
I love that. And was that focus group here in Phoenix Metro?
Yes, it was actually hosted at the Flint Foundation.
Oh, beautiful. Awesome. So we got great representation for these community conversations from the Black and African American communities here in Metro Phoenix. Our great friends up in Cottonwood in Northern Arizona that you, Scott, organized. Kristi and Don and the team at the Civic Life Partnership also facilitated other community conversations throughout the state of Arizona, including our friends down in Southern Arizona and more here in the central part of our state. But Teniqua, as you kind of entered the room that we're all familiar with at the Flinn Foundation, hosting the great alumni of your leadership programs, what were sort of what message did you bring to that space? What was the headline that you presented to your folks? And then coming out of that community conversation, if you were to hold up a newspaper, what would the headline be as well?
Well, I'll just kind of start with it. I think what's really great is everyone was just curious to actually see the language itself. And so I try to ask our leaders to go in it with perspective and the ability to ask questions versus go in at attack. And so what I think was really great about this is three things really stuck out, I thought was one is it was the synthesis of the data. And when I think about what the state of Black Arizona represents, we first realized that the sample size wasn't big enough for us to really voice, I think, strong enough opinions or to lay something down that we would actually want to be in a report. So we asked a lot of questions about that. And then on the other side of that, David, we were like, well, we can't actually then synthesize, or should we give opinions on the more dominant group that was reflected of those who identify as white? Because now that isn't a fair take of it. So we had to really step back and say, this is like not, something we could put closure to or have a conclusion, because we really recognize like we need a larger sample size, and then of that sample size we wanted it disaggregated when we were looking at the areas of age and looking at the areas of positive and negative. So we really just kind of left it with, here's some things to think about. So one, that synthesis, and I talk about that because a lot of times when we're trying to do our reports, if the sample size isn't large enough, we can't use that data. We can't have it reflective of the community. So I think that was one thing. And sometimes even when we've done the work with the Gallup poll, we've seen that sometimes our community sees it differently or is experiencing things differently. So we can't say that everyone is experiencing it, that we need to be able to share why those words are different. So I think the synthesis of the data, language matters so much. As you talked about earlier, I think Siri and Kristi, you talked about how privilege and social justice were at the top as negatives, and then unity and liberty were at the positive. And some of those words that were throughout were equalizers for us to be at the table, but yet they weren't seen as words that were either at the top or seen as words that could be bridge builders. And then identity matters. Like at the end of the day, when you're thinking about this work, for us, it was like, am I even aggregated? And if I am, how is that a place for me to be disaggregated so I can understand how I show up in these numbers as it relates to Arizona. So those were our top themes, and I'll give Scott some space to be able to share his.
All good. Yeah. Thank you just for highlighting those challenges in the data. And I think it's something we also heard from our brothers and sisters in our tribal communities throughout the state that didn't see themselves in the data as well. And it certainly isn't our intent to have a complete erasure of those communities. There are certain limitations with the data and the amount of the sample size and whatnot. So we certainly do have a commitment, especially through these community conversations, with ensuring those voices are heard in that in this process and the project, including the really important voices. And I'm biased because I'm from rural Southern Arizona, of rural voices. So Scott, what were the headlines that you went into your community conversation in Cottonwood around the data and then from the conversations?
Yeah, thank you. I'll kind of look at it pre, during, and then post. And I think that Siri, I really appreciate her saying that there's no bad words, but as several people have said, words matter. So even in our invitation, we use the term civic health. And that's a term that might be negative and might not be understood in rural. So again, that's where that curiosity came from. And that was a learning lesson for me. Oh, okay, read the data, think about the words that you use in your invitations, and that might affect who shows up. But then we did use that really positive word of community. So the community conversations, interactive, listening, participatory. So I think that's what drew people in. While we were there, the the thought that we heard, Kristi mentioned that we did a poll too, and to see if it was positive or negative. And a lot of the reflections back were, gosh, I don't know exactly what that word means, but I know groups that use it, and I don't necessarily align with those groups. So I'm going to answer it this way. And I think one example that comes true for the rural leaders that we work with is activism. So we spend a whole half day of our curriculum teaching people how to be activists. But if you only think that the activists are the bad guys or on the other side of the issues that you're on, then you might not see yourself as an activist. So we really want to not just use words, but give definitions to words, and then more importantly, give examples. And here's how you do that. Here's how you register to the request to speak, and here's how you show up for a committee meeting hearing, and things like that. So that's how we put those words, demystify the words and put them into action. And then I think walking out the door was common good. And gosh, the common good was similar and most overlapped in most of the demographics: race, age, rural, urban. Common good and common ground was all in the middle. So that's really what keeps us going forward, is bringing more people to the conversation, because the more people, then you can get more in common. And it takes longer and it's harder to listen, but that's where we're moving.
David, can I say something? Because I think many may not know this, but Scott and I work on a racial justice curriculum. And Scott, it makes me think about when we are in our planning stage, thinking about the entry for people to participate. And we think about the language a lot. It's not about washing it down or anything. It's really about how can people hear us and understand those perspectives. And so when I was listening to you, it really made me think about the last few years of like how we got to a place where it clicked better for people to really understand what we meant, specifically understanding that in rural communities, they may not see people who look like me, but how there's commonality in what we're trying to fight for when it comes for those inequities.
Yes, and moving towards equity. Thank you, Teniqua. That's what we're building towards, equity.
Yeah, I love that example. Kristi, I am going to tie in this question from Jane Anderson from the Q&A. Jane, hello, friend. Will there be a survey for youth 14 to 17 in the future? It would be interesting to see their perspective. As a mom of 4, I think the point of view of my children are more nuanced than mine and very interesting. So I know as part of the community conversations, there were conversations with young Arizonans. I'm not quite sure if they were as young as 14 to 17, but how are the youth of Arizona reflecting on this data?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much. So we did partner with Northern Arizona University. We're really grateful to work with their Center for Volunteerism and Public Service. So we weren't in the K-12 space, but we were at NAU with students who were studying civic engagement. Actually, I think their minor was referred to as civic engagement. So any conversation we had, we then reflected on what are the words being used around this conversation. So this data really was in our minds quite a bit. The students in that class had just really fascinating input and reactions to the terms. We also had the opportunity to hear from statewide AmeriCorps members through that partnership with NAU. So young people who are serving with organizations really across the state and hear their perspectives. So that is kind of captured in the report and the overall takeaways. This idea of what do it mean to engage with K-12 students, I think is really interesting. I'd also love to hear from Siri and Pace of whether they've considered that. I know a couple of our colleagues in the civic education space have raised that as a potential area of interest. Wouldn't it be interesting to kind of delve into that? And I will say that we did have a really interesting finding in the research, which is the role of civic education. That folks reflecting, if they had had some memory or experience of civic education, it actually connected much more strongly to positive perceptions of the terms. And for Arizonans, even more strongly. So terms, I think it was democracy, if I have it right, that created a 14 percentage point jump if folks responded having had an experience or exposure to civic education. For Arizona, that jumped 30 percentage points. So regardless of overall educational attainment, the role of civic education here, I think, was really key and kind of emerged in the data. So I think being able to actually talk to K-12 students and young people and hear more of their perspectives would be really interesting. But Siri, from the national perspective, I don't know if you all have delved a little bit more deeply into that.
We haven't gone too deeply into that, though we certainly keep hearing that there's a lot of interest in knowing what younger people think. So we'll see what happens as we continue this work. I do have one example from the 2021 round of research, because we had a mini grant process where different organizations could apply for some seed funding to use the data. And we had a school, actually a Montessori school, that brought the terms and did some education around them. And then they had students do art projects. So students could pick one term and do a little bit more research on that term. And then they created a piece of art that represented their understanding of that term based on what they had learned through the process at their school. And that was actually my number one favorite mini grant project, because then they sent us the artwork. They sent us photos of the artwork, and what those students came up with visually in terms of communicating the essence of those terms is pretty cool. So I think there's a lot of potential, especially for creating opportunities that can engage these concepts in more modes than just the written word.
I love that. I remember seeing those visuals at the
Yeah.
the PACE convening, and surprised that they just weren't like big black box with censored. They actually had really profound visual representations of the words.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shane, for that question, and Siri for that follow-up. As we close out this kind of panel, please do continue to use the Q&A with questions you have for our great panelists. We'll continue to have them live, but just bringing it back to Teniqua, how do you hope to, you kind of alluded now with Scott about the kind of the curriculum and the shared usage, but how do you hope to use this, these learnings in your own civic health work?
Yeah, I think Kristi probably already knows this. Like, of course, we want a bigger sampling size if we had an opportunity, because I definitely think understanding the perceptions of words is so important. I'm in a space where I'm working with African American leaders, where a lot of times they don't necessarily always feel like people understand exactly what they say. And if I'm using certain terms, you may be defining it differently. And so when people ask me all the time, like, well, how do you define, equity? Like, we can get 14 different definitions. And so what I think is important as the bridge builder for this is that language may have perceptions for different people in different groups, but are you willing to hear the other person's understanding of how it shows up for them? And so when Scott said, people are like, oh, I know someone who talks about that or uses that word, I may not align. What is your real understanding? And so for me, two truths can exist. So at the same time, a word that you may perceive as one way is a word that actually shows up different. Are you willing to understand how it affects me in the way that I live, but also the way that it is seen and viewed by someone in the places I work, live, and play. And that's what I think is really important. The group is curious to continue to understand language, because language can either separate us or bring us together. And so our goal is really to think about how we can get to that common middle.
Thank you so much. And Scott?
Yeah, a concrete example of what we've done since we had our community conversation was building off of common good and common ground. We brought in a speaker, retired from the newspaper industry, and he lives in Tucson, a U of A grad, started off his work as a beat reporter for the Arizona Daily Star, and he ended his time in that industry as the publisher for the Boston Globe. And we had him talk about his personal research at the end about common purpose, our common purpose, what's our common good. And when you have those things, where do you see yourself in it? So that's one thing that we did with our current class of leaders, working around that common good idea. The other piece is something that's harder, and as Teniqua was mentioning, you actually need more time, because to understand what somebody else means, even if it's just a one-on-one conversation, you have to ask the question, and then you have to listen to the answer and go back and forth. So as I think about that as a curriculum building, or as I think about that for our alumni events in different corners of the state, we need actually more time, and we need less speakers, and we need more time for connection with each other. So that's what we'll be building into our work moving forward.
I love that. Thank you so much, Scott. And Kristi, just kind of bringing it back up to the Civic Life partnership that you have this great collaborative effort with Don and the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership. What is the next step?
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, I will echo a couple of things that were shared by Teniqua and Scott, and thank you both for your partnership in this process. I think the theme today of curiosity was really interesting to hear folks use the word curious several times, because that really was kind of the spirit of this project and how we hope folks will use the research and the report moving forward, of the idea of really seeking to kind of spark that understanding that Teniqua was describing, of going a little bit further in seeing where are there bridges to be built, where is there maybe shared meaning, if not using the same terms. And that's what we hope this project is really in service of. And I think all of this really for the Civic Life Partnership is ultimately towards strengthening civic health for Arizona. So one of the ways that we're doing that is also using data to understand, well, how are we engaged in our communities? So this effort in really thinking about how do we talk about and kind of create meaning around issues of civic engagement. What are the ways that Arizonans are really participating and showing up in community today? And we have tools called the Civic Health Progress Meters that provide some of that data and insight to benchmark that. And what we're excited about is coming soon in the next few weeks, we'll have an update on those Civic Health Progress Meters for Arizona. And we also will be inviting all of you, partners on this call, folks who have been with us in this journey, to be a part of the next phase of that work. So coming together to say, well, what does that mean for us to understand how Arizonans are engaged in different ways? Where are there gaps? Where are there opportunities to really take action and to really multiply our impact by working more together? So we'll invite all of you joining us today to be a part of that process. And in the meantime, we hope that the Civic Language Project resources and research and conversation are really that spark of further understanding and curiosity, and that folks on the call use that as a resource in the work they're doing right now that we know is so critical in actually strengthening civic health.
Yeah, I'm so excited for that work to evolve in this coming year. Of course, 2026 is when our country celebrates its 250th anniversary, and the work that's spearheaded through the Center for the Future of Arizona and the Civic Health Progress Meters will be a culminating event as we kind of mirror the great success of the education progress meters and set a new agenda and new benchmarks for our civic health progress meters. So hopefully folks that are engaged in the Flinn-Brown network, those that are participating in the CivEx and more broadly through the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership can stay engaged as we outline that whole strategy to set the civic health progress meters. I am just thrilled to see how that can happen. Of course, all leading to America 250, which Arizona will have a strong roll in with our own commission out of the Secretary of State's office. Kristi Tate, thank you so much for your friendship and your partnership in this space. Siri Erickson with PACE, I am so honored and to be part of the PACE network, a super user of that network as well. Thank you so much for all of your efforts. Scott and Teniqua, always a pleasure to be able to partner with you all in this space, but also just working to make our great state of Arizona so much stronger. Thank you all so much for participating in this CivEx. I am once again proud to host this session as a Flinn-Brown Fellow and as a director at Vitalyst Health Foundation. The recording and materials will be sent in a follow-up email and posted to the Flynn communication channels. Thank you so much for your interest and nerdiness with us. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.